Good morning. My name is Sally Kate Carroll, and I'm one of the pastoral residents at the Orchard in Starkville. This morning, we are continuing on in the book of Acts, and today we are in Acts chapter 13. There's so much in this chapter, so I encourage you to either pause the video now and go read the whole chapter, or to read the whole chapter after we finish, because we're just going to zoom in on the first few verses. So there's so much happening, even in just the first 3 verses. It starts out by listing prophets and teachers who are essential to the church at Antioch. People that are from all over, every tribe, every tongue, every nation. You know, you get the... It goes on to talk about these men worshiping and fasting. It doesn't necessarily say if they were fasting for any particular reason, but in their worship, in their practice of the spiritual disciplines, the Holy Spirit speaks to them. So verses 2 and 3 say, "One day as these men were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, 'Appoint Barnabas and Saul for their special work to which I have called them.' So after more fasting and prayer, the men laid their hands on them and sent them on their way." It's worth noting that the church at Antioch sent Paul and Barnabas on their way. They didn't just meander on, they sent. They were intentionally sending them forth on this missionary journey to spread the news about Jesus. This began the first of Paul's missionary journeys. They began traveling all over, and after a few stops, they reach Paphos, which is where they meet a false prophet that tried to interrupt the missionary efforts of Barnabas and Paul. This Elymas, the sorcerer, was actively trying to keep the governor from believing. So skip ahead to verse 9. In verse 9 through 12 say, "Saul, also known as Paul, was filled with the Holy Spirit, and he looked the sorcerer in the eye. Then he said, 'You son of the devil, full of every sort of deceit and fraud, an enemy of all that is good, will you never stop perverting the true ways of the Lord? Watch now, for the Lord has laid his hand of punishment upon you, and you will be struck blind. You will not see the sunlight for some time.' Instantly, mist and darkness came over the man's eyes, and he began groping around, begging for someone to take his hand and lead him. When the governor saw what had happened, he became a believer, for he was astonished at the teaching about the Lord." Isn't that just like a wild story? And whenever I read this, I can't help but to think back to when Paul was blinded on the road to Damascus by the Lord. God gave both of them a physical blindness that matched their spiritual blindness. Although we know Paul repented and could see again. Paul was harsh with the sorcerer. He knew that the governor's faith was at stake. And we, these days we have to be aware of falling into that trap. Either way, we have to be wary of those who will try and distort and confuse what God is telling us, like the sorcerer. But we also must be wary of doing that to others, being the sorcerer. So remember at the beginning of this chapter, while worshiping and fasting and practicing spiritual disciplines, they heard the Holy Spirit speak to them. That's how we know if what is said to us is truthful and from God. And, on the flip side, that's how we know if what we are saying is truthful and from God, and not just our own opinions that we're telling people or putting out there. So that's why it's important to practice your disciplines of praying and reading and worshiping and fasting and doing, all that the Lord's called us to. So I hope you'll have a great rest of your day, and I hope you go and read the rest of this chapter, because there's so much more that goes on. Thank you.